Are we ready now? Pardon me. So I'm going to begin with asking, is anyone in the audience a psychologist or a psychiatrist? No. Don't we all? I ask that because I actually enjoy talking to them after the fact to get their commentary on what I'm talking about and the research that I've done. So I'm going to start. I'm used to having my laptop up here. The first thing I want to do is say that the slides and the talk notes for this, I'm one of those people that I abhor people who read from their slides, so I try not to do that. So I do put my talk notes up, and I have a Patreon account. So I have scheduled the notes and the slides to post at 11 a.m. this morning, so they will be out there right after I'm done. You're free to take and use them. I also have other stuff out there like my crypto walkthroughs and all my other materials. Everyone's welcome. And I did say I want to thank Paul Ewan, James Troutman, and Andrew for being my patrons. Everything I do is free. You're welcome to take it, use it, modify it, or anything you want. So I like to give back to the community, so this is my attempt to do that. So a little introduction. I started this research kind of off the side. A couple years ago, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And one of the things you have to do with breast cancer sometimes is get chemotherapy. And one of the side effects of chemotherapy is called chemo brain. And for those who are not familiar with this, it's essentially you start to encounter forgetfulness, memory lapses, difficulty concentrating or focusing on tasks, significant trouble recalling or remembering common words and names. Something as easy as a microphone. You could stand there literally and struggle with, I forgot what this thing is called. And then sometimes just struggling to do more than one task at a time. For all of you in this room, I assume you are brain people, and you're fairly like, I may not be good at a lot of things, I may not be the best looking person, but my brain rocks. I am good. And so when that starts to fall apart, it can be incredibly distressing, especially for folks like us who really use that a lot. Being a hacker, I said, wait a minute, there's got to be a way to fix this, because if you can understand something, you can fix it, right? Or at least try. And I started to do a lot of research into just the brain, how the brain worked, how memory worked, ways you could heal it, etc. And I kept kind of side running into this research being done on implanting passwords into memory. And I kept thinking, like, let me put a pin in that. I'm going to come back to it because it's really interesting. I wonder how that works. But I got to deal with this first. So I have managed to probably recover maybe, I would say, a good 80% of my function. I still struggle. I still forget words. I have notes because of that. And I appreciate you indulging me in using them. But because there wasn't a significant amount of information about it, I had to go out and start researching into what's being done, how it's being done, and I wanted to share that with you because I think it's a really neat concept. I mean, wouldn't it be cool if you didn't have to remember your passwords anymore? They were just there. But at the same time, how secure would that be, you know? So, I mean, there's days I can't remember what I had for breakfast. So I'm like, how am I supposed to remember this complicated password? So what I'm going to do today is talk to you about how this all works. My background, for those who have not met me or not familiar with me or haven't seen me talk before, my undergrad is in sociology, which is the psychology of groupthink versus psychology of individual think. And the brain is going. My graduate work is in cybersecurity and security management, and I tend to be really fascinated with cryptography and just different ways of encoding, decoding, encrypting, decrypting things. So I want to start with some kind of baseline stuff on some common vocabulary and some concepts, so when we get to the other stuff, it'll start to make a little more sense, or at least you have a context to put the research in. And the first thing is talking about cognitive memory. And cognitive memory, or cognition as it's called, is the mental action or process of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experiences, and the senses, okay? So if you think about things like knowledge, your attention, memory, judgment, reasoning, problem solving, things like that, these are all examples of cognitive memory. And cognitive memory can be either conscious or sub/unconscious. I'll get into that in a moment. Pardon my allergies. It can also be intuitive, which is the ability to acquire knowledge without actually understanding how the knowledge was acquired. If you want to think about the concept of instinct, this would be a good one. Or conceptual, which is based on or related to ideas and concepts like you would learn in a classroom or from a demonstration. So consciousness can be defined from either a biological or a philosophical perspective. From a biological perspective, it refers to the idea of being aware of your surroundings, your experiences, being awake and aware of your environment. And then philosophically, it often refers more to having a sense of self-individuality or even a soul, depending on which cultural religion you're looking at. Unconsciousness occurs when your ability to maintain an awareness of yourself or your surroundings or your environment has been lost. So there's a complete or near complete lack of responsiveness to people and other environmental stimulation. And there's also a medical and a legal concept, depending on if you're in a court situation or if you're in like a medical situation. Because medically, someone can be unconscious and unable to respond to stimulus, but legally you can also have a loss of consciousness or awareness as the result of some altered states, like if you're delirious. If you think about some people who get extremely like overheated or even too cold, some types of hypnosis, drug use, etc. And then you can also have like a medical unconsciousness from being like a traumatic brain injury, damage to the central nervous system, use of anesthesia. Has anyone here ever been like so tired you can't think? There you go. That literally is a real thing. And one of the reasons why they get concerned about like drowsy driving, it's really a thing. Like you can actually kind of become unconscious even though you may not look unconscious, and it can be used medically or legally, even like some people have used it in car accident situations, etc. Subconscious is interesting because initially, when Freud used this term, he used the term unconscious and subconscious interchangeably. And this was because in his native German language, the two words were almost very similar. But in general, unconscious typically tends to refer to a state of awareness from a medical perspective, and subconscious tends to refer to an aspect of the psyche when discussing like psychoanalytical kind of things. The best I can tell, because I'm one of those people like, I want to know the definition. So when I went out to look, it still seems like there's a lot of argument about it. There's, you know, semantic arguments, there's grammatical arguments, and there's academical arguments. And they have not, I don't think they've agreed on it yet. But for the purpose of this talk, we're going to look at subconscious as being the part of your consciousness that's not currently in your focal awareness. Right? And then unconsciousness is going to be more of like, you're down for the count and your lights are out. I like Edwin Locke, he's a psychologist. He referred to the subconscious as the alternative storehouse of knowledge and prior experience. So I kind of like how he put that. Now, there's two main types of long-term human memory, explicit and implicit, okay? Explicit memory is the kind of conscious, intentional recollection of factual information, previous experiences, and concepts. So if you think, like when you take a test and you remember when was the War of 1812, you're pulling that explicit memory out of that fact and that knowledge. And there's two different types of explicit memory. We have episodic and semantic. Episodic is when you store a specific experience, and semantic is the part that kind of stores factual information. So if you are thinking back to your very first kiss, that would be an episode or an episodic type of memory, versus if you were thinking about facts about kissing, how many times a day do the average couple kiss, how many kisses have happened since the beginning of time, that kind of stuff would be more of a semantic type of memory. Implicit memory, how many here can ride a bike? Oh my God, I should see more hands raised. Maybe not. I don't know. Has anyone ever looked at how many hackers can ride a bike? That could be a good joke. Anyway, I'm a triathlete, for those who don't know me well, and we use a lot of our training to kind of put things into our implicit memory. And that is, your implicit memory is basically acquired and used more subconsciously, and it can affect your thoughts and behaviors because it's kind of under the surface, like when you're making other decisions, you're calling it up, but you're not focusing on it, if that makes sense. And one of the most common forms of implicit memory is procedural, and it helps people perform certain tasks without conscious awareness of these previous experiences. Again, think like riding a bike. When you get on a bike, every time, for those who don't know how to ride a bike, you don't sit there and go, oh, I have to push this pedal down and do that. It's just you kind of know how to do it, and that would be a good example of implicit memory. So a good way to summarize it would be, if you remember a very specific driving lesson, that is going to be your explicit memory. But if your driving improves as a result of the lesson, that would be an example of implicit memory. So memory is a tool versus memory is an object. This is, again, we're getting into semantics. The gist of it is memory can be treated as an object if you're trying to recall it. And it can also be a tool if you're trying to memorize something. And it's kind of an interesting distinction when you get into some of the research later. Why is this important? It's being considered potentially a subclass of behavioral biometric measurement, okay? And this is where we start to connect with the idea of implanting passwords as a potential option for authentication. So this is where we're going to talk about encoding, storage, and retrieval. Okay, so this is now we're going to get into the meat of how memory works as far as putting it towards the research being done. Encoding is when you process information into your memory. And there's several different ways to encode information. You can have structural encoding. This is how something looks. So, for example, are words long or short, in uppercase or lowercase? Does anyone here speak Japanese or is learning Japanese? So I homeschool. I'm teaching my daughter Japanese, and we're learning it together. And I found a fantastic app that teaches the characters by making pictures out of them to help you remember the character because it's a picture, right? It's really neat, and it uses that kind of structural encoding. Another one is mnemonic encoding, so how does something sound? If you've worked with folks, if you've worked in environments where you hear a lot of different languages, a lot of times you may not understand a specific language, but if you hear someone speaking it, your ear can pick up like, oh, I think he's speaking Russian versus pretty sure that's Spanish. You may not actually know what he's saying, but you can tell a difference, and that's your mnemonic encoding. And then semantic encoding is more of it focuses more on meaning. So it's kind of a deeper level of processing, and they say this results in much better memories when you attach a meaning to something versus just a visual or an audio type of connection. Storage. So after information enters your brain, it has to be stored or maintained. There's a three-stage model proposed by Richard Atkinson and Richard Schifrin. It's often used to describe this process. I could not find a graphic of it, so I made you one. So information stored sequentially in 3 memory systems. You have your sensory memory, your short-term memory, and your long-term memory. Sensory memory stores incoming sensory information in detail, but only for an instant. The capacity is huge, but the information in it is not processed. So a great example would be like if you've been in a dark room and someone's had a flashlight or a glow stick and they're waving it around. Your sensory memory is what's capturing that movement in light. Visual central memory is called iconic memory, and auditory is called echoic memory. Short-term memory, some of the information in sensory memory, it can get transferred to short-term memory, and it can hold information for maybe about 20 seconds. Rehearsing can help keep your information in the short-term memory. So have anyone ever like parked your car and been like, green P2, green P2, green P? That's a great example of rehearsing something to try and like kind of make it stick in your memory a little better. You can also do it with names, I've learned. And short-term memory has a limited capacity. It can store about 7 pieces of information, plus or minus 2 pieces. And these pieces of information can be small, like individual numbers or letters, or larger, like strings of numbers, words, or sequences. Think about when you learned how to read. You don't go back now as an adult and say, C-A-T is cat. You've memorized that string is cat. So you've kind of chunked it, and that's one of the techniques used for keeping the memory, is chunking things. Short-term memory is also known as your working memory, so you can keep things in there while you process or examine it. Information can be transferred from short-term memory to long-term memory, and from long-term memory back to short-term memory. And that takes you to the long-term memory, where it has an almost infinite capacity, and the information in long-term memory usually stays there for the duration of a person's life. And you're like, well, that's great, Tess. Why can't I remember my 3rd grade English teacher's name? Well, the problem is just because it's there doesn't mean you can get it out. That's essentially where it sits. You can't always retrieve it. And that is what takes us into, this is kind of where I started doing my own research, because I knew the information was in there. I just couldn't get it out. And so that was what started me on this thing, was trying to like, how can I get better at retrieving and dusting that stuff off and getting back into my own mind. So that'll take us to retrieval. So retrieval is the process of getting the information back out of your memory. Retrieval cues are stimulus that kind of help you go in and search for those things and remember them. And they can include associations, context, and mood. You're going to like the next slide. Oh.
What the hell?
I didn't do it.
Sure you did. I believe you.
Just a small glitch in the matrix, folks. We're fine. So, the furries are for you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. I am furry. I'm not a furry.
Semantics. Context. So people can remember an event often by placing themselves in the same context there and when the event happened. Who here has lost their keys? And they've gone like, okay, I got out of the car, I walked over here, I did and then they find their keys in the refrigerator, right? I've done it, I own it, right? So that's an example of context, when you kind of walk through something and place yourselves where you were when you last remembered and then work from there, or try to recall something. Sometimes, as a police officer, when we were trying to work with witnesses, we would have them close their eyes and put themselves like back where they were and look around in their mind picture and try to remember things. And like they couldn't stand there and tell you, but when they actually closed their eyes and put themselves back in context in their mind, they were able to recall certain things or get a better picture or more details.
I don't have anything to tell you.
There's nothing here.
Is it feet dropping down?
You know, it really doesn't matter because I don't read from my slides. We're good.
It's all good.
It's just pretty pictures to look at while I talk.
It's listening to you too.
Can you hear me? Is it the audio or just visual?
That's
Okay.
it's ain't messing up over here.
Someone needs to call
Are you
the...
dropping out too? I can't.
No.
Okay. All right. Woo, still better than chemo. Okay, so associations This is when the brain stores information as networks of associated concepts. So recalling a particular word becomes easier if another related word is recalled first. Sometimes they call this priming. An example might be like if you show your friend a picture of sunbathers on a nude beach, which I didn't put nude people in the slide because I was told that was tacky. And then if you ask them to spell the word bear, like B-E-A-R, big furry animal in your mind, they might be more likely to spell the word bear, B-A-R-E, because they've got that picture in front of them, so they're associating with bear versus bear. So that's kind of how association works. And then mood. If people are in the same mood they were during an event, they may have an easier time recalling the event. This can work in good ways like nostalgia. Like as I was thinking about John Denver driving into West Virginia and all those warm memories of childhood, but it also can work in bad ways, such as I have friends who were overseas, and if they hear like a loud noise or they have a smell or they see something that kind of brings back that memory, and then it puts them in that mood, and then it pulls more memories back up. So it can kind of work both ways, but that's how mood works to help memory. Yes, sir?
Is there any truth? I've heard people say that it smells like one of the best keys for memory. Is there actually research to back that up, though?
I believe there is, and I will tell a small personal story. When I was getting my chemo treatments, they used alcohol before they put the needles in, and I associated the alcohol smell with it was so bad that I literally would vomit when he opened the alcohol. And so he swears he will say to the end of time, he will deny doing this because I think it's against like a whole bunch of hygiene laws. But it was actually so bad that I would bring vodka to my chemo treatments, and he would use that instead because it didn't have a smell.
It had a different smell than the normal F-wit.
It just didn't have that like isopropyl medical sanitary, because it was so triggering to me that even after the chemo, probably for about at least a year, anytime I smelled isopropyl alcohol, I literally would have to grab a garbage can. It was so bad. I agree with people who say that.
Food's like that too.
Yes.
You smell food, you remember where you ate it first.
And it can really, just smells are, like he said, a very, very strong trigger. And it was actually one of the tricks I used when I was working on my memory stuff. So, personal experience, I agree with the research. So finally, we're getting into the good stuff, right? Passwords and human memory limitations. Now, I'm going to share the fact that I gave this talk at DEF CON, and my numbers were wrong. And I'm going to share that because I know a lot of people, just maybe who watching this, who are worried about being a failure or the imposter syndrome. My numbers were wrong. I was pulling my numbers from like multiple pieces of research that agreed, but apparently they were all citing an incorrect source. Not being a doctor, I did not know this, but I had a gentleman come up to me after DEF CON and tell me, hey, those numbers are kind of more for like a rabbit, not a human. Thank you very much. I have corrected my slides. See, it's easy, guys. You don't know, you go, okay. No harm, no foul. So these slides are corrected. Number of neurons in the human brain is somewhere around 100 billion. And then the number of connections each neuron forms with other neurons is around 10,000. And the resultant number of connections is somewhere in the realm of 1,000 trillion. I'm sure some of you know people that probably don't have that many connections, but on average, there's about your number. Your total brain memory storage capacity, I had 2.5 petabytes. My new research, because I was going back to correct my numbers, my new research puts it in the range of 1 to 1,000 terabytes. I'm going to tell you right now, they don't know. They're just guessing. These are their best guesses. I share them with you. Yes.
People say we only use like 10% of our brain. Did they actually say we know what 10% of the brain does?
You know, I will tell you this. We know more about outer space than we do about the deepest ocean and the human brain. So there's so much research out there. I mean, it's a whole field in and of itself, and even those people can agree on things. But the research I've seen kind of goes to both. Some argue we only use 10%, others argue we only know about the 10% that we use. It's really, we know more about IT than we know about the brain. So, current research. This was pretty neat stuff. I need to do a time check. All right, I'm not going to go into some of the details on some of the other limitations because we started a little late. So, I'm sure most of you have heard of brain-computer interface. I don't know. The initial motivation behind brain-computer interfaces was to develop communication devices for the severely disabled. Since I don't have a lot of time, I'm not going to go into the deep dive about how you can actually, they're doing research on how you can train your mu and beta waves to control a cursor on your screen, like literally control the cursor with your brain. And then there's also this really cool concept I found called visual evoked potentials. And there's so much research out there. You can just, if you can't sleep one night, start it, and you'll pretty much put yourself to sleep. But I do want to point you to the research of Dr. J.R. Wolpaw, W-L-O-L-P-A-W, and his research team as a starting point, and the thought translation device that was developed by a Dr. Niels Berbaumer in the University of Tübingen, Germany, and it basically allows users to compose phrases and sentences just by thinking about them. And then there's also a paper out of Dartmouth about something called a neurophone. Has anyone heard of this? So the neurophone is a brain mobile phone interface using a wireless EEG headset, and the team talks about basically how they have a brain-controlled address book dialing app they created. So that's kind of neat to read about. But the point is that there's a ton of research being done on using the brain to interface directly with technology and removing that need to use your hands. And a lot of it, again, has been done because of people with disabilities or people that have had severe injuries or even the traumatic brain type of injuries. But there's 4 key pieces of research that I found and I wanted to talk about. The first one is this, the Niels Berbaumer one, and this one seriously it seems like it really kicked everything off, and I really recommend people kind of like go into that and read on it if you're interested in this. And this is literally a mobile phone app. I do believe it's like currently on the market that you can use. But there wasn't a lot around it that I dug into on the security of it or how widespread it's being used. Has anyone here played Guitar Hero? Okay. Do you know what Guitar Hero is? Okay, just checking. I'm like, I expected many more hands to go up. So the first one that I thought was really interesting is called SISL, Serial Interception Sequence Learning. Okay, and it was a gentleman, I'm going to butcher his name, Hristo Buzhinov at Stanford, and he was working with some cognitive scientists at Northwestern, and they designed a game that looks similar to Guitar Hero, and they tested it using Amazon's Mechanical Turk. Are you familiar with that? No. Okay, so Mechanical Turk's kind of neat. It's a crowdsourcing internet marketplace that enables people to coordinate the use of human intelligence to perform tasks. And a lot of researchers are turning to it now because you can pay the people who will do the tasks or do the research, like kind of be your test subjects. And I think it's cheaper than actually trying to like pay actual people to come into your lab, or you can do it over like a wider area because you're not limited to just getting people in your local geography to do the testing. But it is, in my opinion, this was also kind of relevant for their results and their stuff later, which I'll address. But here's how it works, and I'm actually going to read this because I don't want to mess it up. So, the process of learning the password or the cryptographic key involves the use of a specifically crafted computer game that resembles Guitar Hero. And there are 6 buttons, S, D, F, J, K, and L, and the user has to hit the corresponding key or note when the circle reaches the bottom fret. So during a typical training session, which is around 45 minutes, remember that number, a user will make about 4,000 keystrokes. And around 80% of these keystrokes are being used to subconsciously teach you a 30-character password. Before running, the game creates a random sequence of 30 letters chosen from S, D, F, J, K, and L with no repeating characters. And this equates to around 38 bits of entropy, and that's thousands to millions times more secure than the average memorable password. The 30-character sequence is played back to the user 3 times in a row, and then it's padded out with 18 random characters for a total of 108 items. The sequence is repeated 5 times, there's a short pause, and then the entire process is repeated 6 more times. By this point, their experimental results suggest that the 30-letter password is firmly implanted in your subconscious brain. Authentication requires that you play a round of the game, but this time your 30-letter sequence is interspersed with other random 30-letter sequences. So to pass the authentication, you have to reliably perform your sequence, and the research shows that even after 2 weeks, it seems you're still able to recall this sequence. Kind of interesting, huh? Next, we have something called pass thoughts, and this is from Berkeley. Around 2013, a team of the researchers came up with this futuristic system, and the technique combines 3 factors: something you know, which is a thought, something you are, which is your brain patterns, and then something you have, which is an EEG sensor for measuring your brain waves. To authenticate with pass thought, you think your secret key while you wear the sensor. And this key can be just about anything: a song, a phrase, a mental image. The thought itself is never actually transmitted, just the mathematical representation of the electrical signals that your brain makes while you're thinking it. So if someone else wants to figure out exactly what you were thinking, they couldn't necessarily impersonate your past thought because every person thinks the same thought differently. So I'm looking at the ages of the folks. Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin, right? We can all think of that song. We probably were all going to think about it in a slightly different way, maybe here. So even if we all know that that's my past thought, you're probably not going to be able to think about it the same way I would, right? And so that's one of the security aspects of it, is that people don't think alike, which is, again, ties back to this being a potential biometric type of thing. So the following tasks were repeated 5 times in each session. They had a breathing task, they had a simulated finger movement, sports task, a song passage recitation task, an eye and audio tone task, object counting task, and a past thought task, where this is where they actually chose the past thought in their mind. Now this entire sequence took, maybe 20 minutes, but they had to do multiple rounds. So again, think about how much time this is going to take. If you have an organization of 1,000 people and you've got to set them all up, right? One of the things, okay, I'm going to get to that one after the next one. So on the feasibility of side-channel attacks with brain-computer interfaces. So this was a team. It was Ivan Martinovic, Doug Davies, Mario Frank, Danielle Perito, Thomas Ross, and Dawn Song. And they have studied the possibility of a side-channel attack using commercial EEG types of headsets to reveal users' private information like banks, ATMs, and PIN digits. And their approach was similar to a guilty knowledge test, where items familiar to a user are assumed to evoke different responses. If anyone saw my counterintelligence talk at DEF CON, I think it was 22, I talk towards the end about one of the techniques they were using for insider threat in Iraq and Afghanistan were basically putting this brain sensor gear on the heads of interpreters, and then they would show some photographs to them and measure their brain waves. And then there are certain photographs embedded in the sequence where if that person was a potential insider threat that was familiar with or had knowledge of certain types of terrorist things that your average interpreter or good guy or friend would not have, they were going to like trigger on those pictures. Even if you couldn't see them like visually do it, you were going to be able to pick it up via their brain waves and be able to identify a potential insider threat. So I thought it was interesting because it actually kind of connected 2 totally different pieces of research I was working on. But with this one, they were doing these the research on trying to see if they could actually like have you be playing what's one of the first-person shooter games? Diablo? Am I old? So they were actually trying to see if like they could make you potentially have to pause and maybe put a PIN number in on your phone or something, but if you had that headset on, maybe they could pull that out. But the problem with their attacks set up in their experiments were it was very intrusive and it was very obvious that they were trying to do this. But that brings us to something called Peep. And I always think of the marshmallow checks. So Peep was actually, they were talking about this in June over the summer, and this is from a phys.org article by Tiffany Womack. If you don't go on phys.org, it is amazing. It's just like so cool science and technology stuff. I highly recommend the website. But the article is called Study Finds Hackers Could Use Brainwaves to Steal Passwords, and this is a quote from the article. Researchers at the University of Alabama at Birmingham suggest that brainwave sensing headsets, also known as EEG, or, oh my God, I'm going to... electroencephalograph headsets need better security after a study reveals hackers could guess a user's passwords by monitoring their brainwaves. And in contrast to the research that was done by the gentleman I just spoke about, they were trying to find a more surreptitious, kind of less intrusive approach to get the information, because they thought it would be much more successful if people didn't realize it was happening to them, kind of like phishing if you think about it. So PEEP stands for Passively Eavesdropping Private Input Via Brainwave Signals, and this came out of University of Alabama and University of California at Riverside. And it extensively references the research that the previous team did. But what they did was they created this keylogger, and they called it PEEP. And according to their paper, so I don't mess it up, as the use of these devices, referring to EEG gaming and entertainment devices headsets, becomes mainstream, a user may enter passwords or private credentials to their computers or mobile phones while the device is being worn by the user. To this end, we study the potential of a malicious app to capture the EEG signals when the users are typing passwords or PINs in virtual or physical keyboards and aim to process these signals to infer the sensitive keystrokes. So the gentleman and his team used one regular store-bought EEG headset, and then they got like kind of a medical grade that was used for scientific research, and they did the tests using both, and they were able to demonstrate how easily a malicious software program could easily passively eavesdrop on a user's brainwaves. And so while typing, the user's inputs correspond to their visual processing as well as hand-eye movement and head muscle movements, and all these movements are captured by the headsets. The team asked 12 people to type a series of randomly generated PINs and passwords into a text box as if they were logging into an online account while they wore the headset in order for the software to train itself on the user's typing and corresponding brainwave. And so from the article, the gentleman who created the system or led the team, in a real-world attack, a hacker could facilitate the training step required for the malicious program to be most accurate by requesting the user enter a predefined set of numbers in order to restart the game after pausing it or take a break, similar to the way a CAPTCHA is used to verify users when logging into websites. The research showed that after a user entered 200 characters, algorithms within their malicious software program could make educated guesses about new characters the user entered by monitoring the EEG data. The algorithm they created was able to shorten the odds of a hacker's guessing a 4-digit PIN from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 20. And it increased the chance of guessing a 6-letter password from about 1 in 500,000 to roughly 1 in 500. So while they're probably not going to be able to like compromise everybody right now, the research is being done. They're working on doing this. They're working on getting better at it. So we'll run through these conclusions real fast. Security posture versus rubber hose cryptanalysis. I love that term. The challenge in testing anything against a rubber hose is that, as far as I know, there's no studies where you can truly test the security method without actually attempting to beat it out of someone.
There's a problem with that?
I don't personally have a problem. What, you know that the comic with the wrench? It's blown up and framed in my office. But as far as I know, most research labs and university facilities, especially after that whole Stanford incident, they are really not going to let their research folks beat someone with a rubber hose. So I honestly think they were sexyizing the title of their paper. But I have a really awesome friend who's a shrink, and my current opinion is that with Sisal and past thoughts, there seem to be some dependence on the consistency of the entry when you authenticate. So if you introduce an actual physical rubber hose attack or some other similarly traumatic method of extraction, in my opinion, this could affect the brain waves themselves or the ability to perform the actions or entry in a manner consistent when the password was set up initially, thus rendering the rubber hose attack useless. So if you think about, if I'm thinking about Stairway to Heaven and I'm getting my password set up and everything's all happy, we're good. But then if you've got me like, my head's on the desk and you're beating me with the hose and I'm trying to think of Stairway to Heaven, it's not going to be the same brainwave pattern going on, you know? So that in and of itself, introducing some sort of trauma to extract is obviously going to alter brainwaves. So let's start with Sisal, the Guitar Hero one. They were able to test the retrieval, and they were able to test basic coercion, and that the test was designed to resist an adversary that tried to fool the authentication system. And the potential attacks, if I was going to go after it, I would go over more like the random generator thing. Do more like go after what's being implanted to begin with and get it there versus trying to like get it out over here. But they have not tested against multiple extraction attempts, eavesdropping, any of that kind of stuff. The mitigation in it is the sequence length is difficult for an attacker to simply memorize and repeat at the speed with which it needs to be input. With past thoughts, a hacker may be able to defeat the system by using a phishing scheme that could trick you into thinking your past thought, capture the output, and then later replay it back to the authentication system to trick it. And the Peep research team pointed out that, you know, it was very intrusive, a lot of the technology that they're trying to test with, but then at the same time, like, how many of, go back to IRA, how many people in your organization actually pay attention? Like, is it really intrusive, or is it just intrusive to us because we need to look out for it? Would it actually be that intrusive to the average staff member that you've got to deal with and help protect? So as to Sisal and past thoughts, they seem to be both still mostly in a theoretical stage. I don't see any addressing of how memory can be affected by things like drugs, injuries, degradation. Not really sure if this is viable for use at large, meaning can anyone use this or only those who have a healthy brain function? I'm a great example. Prior to chemo, gold. During chemo, this just was not functioning properly. Would something like that have worked while I was struggling with that? I don't know. The research has not been done. Another one I thought was funny, considering the environment, was, can you authenticate while you're drunk? Would that impair? I mean, if you put your password in and set it up while you're sober, but then if you know, go out drinking with the guys and then come back, would you still be able to authenticate if that's had an effect on your mental function? And then, of course, my next thought was maybe you shouldn't be able to authenticate if you're drunk. Maybe that's a good security feature. When it comes to Sisal, the cost was another big thing I didn't see addressed. This is all well and good to propose, but what's the exact cost associated with implementing something like this, and who exactly would be able to realistically deploy it? So with Sisal, the training or encoding time was about 45 minutes. With past thoughts, it was 2 40 to 50-minute sessions. For a small organization of like 5 to 10 people maybe, but how long would it take to set up a large global corporation or a government organization if you had to spend that much time with each person to set their password up? That's just crazy. With Sisal, there's certain people this might work good with, but what about factors like their mental capacity or their psychological issues? An example would be my sister-in-law works with special needs kids, and a lot of times they do jobs at the airport. Believe it or not, those are the kids that load those carts up on your airplanes. That's one of their jobs, is they go in and they put all the stuff on the carts for the the attendants to, you know, give you your beer, your nuts, your chips, whatever. Is there anything that would prevent them from being able to do that? So again, is this something you could use, especially if you have people with disabilities? If you have our vets back that maybe have lost limbs or fingers, things like that, they wouldn't be able to play this Guitar Hero game. So as far as, again, like using this to roll out as like, if you have a very diverse organization, I'm not really seeing it being very practical from that perspective. I think it's a really fascinating idea with potential, but I also think the research is still really new. And the other issue I had with the sample groups were really small. Okay, so any science folks in here remember your, you know, setting up an experiment. So size, experiment number 1 was done with 35 participants. That's all this was tested on, was 35 people. Number 2, they did with 2 groups, one of 32 participants and one of 80. That's a total of 147 people if there are no duplicates between the 2 studies, which were done online using volunteers who were paid. So based on my own experience, I'm not sure 147 represents a solid sample size, other than whether or not it warrants further study. And I do think it warrants further study, but so far it's more theoretical than practical in my opinion. The past thoughts material I read was based on a research group of a total of 15 people. That's all this has been tested on, is 15 people. Okay, and the Sidechannel Attack research consisted of 28 folks, and Peep had 12 subjects only. So looking at sample size for a lot of this research, this is still in its like infant stages, okay? And the hackability, I think I mentioned the rubber hose attack being like, you know, in reality, is that an issue? And then, pardon me. I talked about going after the random generator with Sisal. Sisal's not designed to prevent eavesdropping or shoulder surfing, so it's very possible if you have the ability to hack into security cameras or any sort of like observation type thing, and you can record someone performing their sequence, you could potentially steal their sequence. Sisal is a Flash application. So, again, in closing, there's some really neat research being done. I really think there's some interesting potentials using the brain as a tool. I'm not sure anything has been done yet to make me think, hey, I got to go get this for my company, but enough has been done that I'm really interested in continuing to follow the research. And then the last thing I wanted to share, I thought this was kind of neat. Oh. These are my sources. If you pull my slides down that I'll post up, you will find all the research papers, the sources. I do include links, but I wouldn't click on my own links either. So I do have the full name of the paper. If you go to Google Scholar, you can pull all this stuff up. It's all out there. So any sci-fi fans in the audience? So I thought this was really neat. I kind of stumbled across this. Someone told me about it. In 1985, this gentleman wrote a book called Hardboiled Wonderland and the End of the World. And in the book, it's parallel narratives. And one of the people is a Calcutech, which is a human data processor / encryption system that's been trained to use their subconscious as an encryption key. This is from 1985, kind of neat. And then the other narrator is a newcomer to a strange, isolated town. And I won't tell you anymore and spoil it if you want to read it. But I just thought it was kind of neat that even as far back as 1985, the idea of using your mind to be an encryption key was kind of been floating around out there. And that concludes my presentation. Do you have any questions? You can clap if you want. You look like that poor monkey with the cymbals, but your batteries were dying. All right, well, thank you then. I don't know who's next.